Introduction. I'm truly humbled. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and very good afternoon to everyone. I hope I'm audible. Oh, please. So before I begin formally, I would like to say something. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Brigadier General Mustafil Kareem for his kind invitation. This is my first visit to Bangladesh, and it's only because of his efforts that I'm here today. It is truly an honor for me to participate in this Cancer Congress and to share the platform with colleagues and hematologists who are actually shaping the future of stem cell transplant in this country. I think the data presented by Dr. Jannat, it is highly impressive. I'm really truly impressed by the advancements and the progress in the field of stem cell transplant in Bangladesh. And I think Professor Brigadier General Mustafil Kareem, along with his team, I think their contribution is truly commendable. I wish you all the best for future prospects. So I would, and I think, yeah, so the task given me today is to talk about haploidentical stem cell transplant in transfusion-dependent thalassemia, which is a little complicated disease to treat when it comes to haploidentical stem cell transplant. And I would like to apologize in advance for taking at least 30 minutes of your time because the topic is little comprehensive. So I'm sure it will not be boring, and I'll try to keep you guys engaged in the talk. So I have nothing to disclose. This is just a brief outline. I will start with an overview of global burden and the outcomes of MSD transplants, and then I will quickly move on to discuss the concepts and strategies of haploidentical stem cell transplant and how this strategy has evolved over the years to reform the outcomes. So let's begin by looking at the global burden of thalassemia. Approximately 40,000 infants are born every year with this disease. This is according to WHO estimates. And majority of these births occur in low middle income countries. That is the South Asian region, as you can see here in this map. The countries which have got the highest burden include Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. And the reasons are very obvious. It's because of the strong cultural trends of getting married into families, which leads to the passing on of this genetic trait from one generation to another. And despite of having national prevention programs and working on the prevention strategies, you know, this number is not diminishing. So I would say that, like, because of diverse genetic ethnicity, approximately 1.5% of the world's population has become a carrier for beta thalassemia, which has actually resulted in increase in the number of at-risk population, which is a social dilemma basically. And unfortunately, in low middle income countries like ours, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, the life expectancy of a thalassemic child, on average, it ranges between 10 to 12 years only. And this low lifespan is basically attributable to the poor healthcare resources, services available in the country, and mainly because of inaccessibility to adequate transfusion services, safe transfusion practices, iron chelation facilities, and above all, the option of the curative treatment, which is hematopoietic stem cell transplant. It is unfortunately available for only a limited number of patients. Vast majority of patients remain deprived of this facility because of unaffordability, non-availability in most of the regions. So thalassemia, despite being a curative disease, it continues to cause a significant mortality and morbidity in this region. That is why it is very important to cater this disease in however way we can. So before embarking into transplant strategies, I would just quickly like to revisit the goals of stem cell transplant in thalassemia. Why do we need this procedure and what do we actually achieve out of it? So the first and the foremost goal that we want to achieve with stem cell transplant is to restore the effective erythropoiesis, that is by replacing the defective bone marrow of the recipient with healthy donor stem cells, which are capable of producing normal blood cells, normal red blood cells basically. So this actually eliminates the requirement of lifelong transfusion in these patients and actually improve the quality of life. The second most important goal that we want to achieve is to prevent the end organ damage, which occurs in these patients as a result of continuous lifelong transfusions and iron overload. For example, cardiac failure is very common, liver fibrosis is very common in these patients. So stem cell transplant can prevent this further damage, and also sometimes it allows the restoration of normal organ function partially in these patients. Then the ultimate goal of a stem cell transplant is to increase the life expectancy of these patients and to improve the quality of life. And I think all the hematologists sitting here, transplantants sitting here, they will agree with me that nothing gives us more pleasure than seeing a thalassaemic child growing like any other normal healthy individual. I think this is the only achievement we look for when we plan a transplant in a patient. So this table summarizes the key studies which have been published over the last 10 to 15 years from developing countries in which the outcomes of MSC transplants have been reported. So I've tried to pick only those studies which include high-risk thalassemia patients, and if you look at the data, all these studies, they comprise of, big numbers of patients, 74, 193. Median age, if you look at the median age of the patients, I don't know whether this is not working, I think. It works here, but it doesn't work here. It's okay. So median age of these patients who receive MSC transplants remains between 6 to 11 years, and almost all the papers have reported using myeloablative conditioning regimes with standard GVHD profile X-rays. And if you look at the outcomes, very low and acceptable rates of graft failure in TRM have been reported, let's say between 6 to 12%, which is, I think, really commendable as far as the outcome and data from low middle income countries is concerned. So I think as far as MSC transplant is concerned, we guys like in Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, we are doing great jobs. So this, I think this gives the transplanters a motivation to go for alternative donor transplants, because the data for MSC transplant is so encouraging that it compels us to think that we can do much better than this. So the biggest challenge that we face as transplanters in our day-to-day practice is when a family comes with a thalassaemic child and they seek consultation for stem cell transplantation. So the first thing that we have to look for is the availability of a matched sibling donor, because thalassemia is a genetic disorder. So in one family you can have like 2 or 3 thalassemic children. So sometimes you do not find a healthy donor. All the patients are diseased. So this is the biggest challenge, and as per the literature published from Asian countries, the probability of finding a matched sibling donor in the family is only 35 to 40%. So unfortunately, almost 60% of the patients remain deprived of this treatment facility, even though they are a potential candidate for transplant. So in order to overcome this shortage of donors, researchers and study groups have explored the option of using a 2 to 3 loci mismatched haplodonors for the utilization of transplant. And this is like across the globe in all hematological indications, whether it be malignancies or whether it be a non-malignant condition. The donor shortage is a universal issue. So with the unprecedented success of this modality of treatment in hematological malignancies, gradually we started developing this, we started to utilize this modality of treatment for non-malignant conditions, including thalassemia and rare genetic disorders. If you see, look at this graph which has been adopted from the CIBMTR database. Unfortunately, I cannot point out, it is not working, maybe I cannot see it, but if you look at this green bar, this represents the this represents the number of transplants by donor type in United States. This number started to rise from early 2000, and then if you look at the surge drastic increase occurred after 2010, and this was after the introduction of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, which actually reformed the outcomes of haplotransplants in hematological malignancies. So based on this, in Asian countries like China, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, they all started to adapt this same strategy for patients who are suffering with thalassemia. This table here represents the historical outcomes of haploidentical stem cell transplant for beta thalassemia reported in the EBMT registry between the years 2000 to 2010. So it means this is this data represents the initial years of haploidentical stem cell transplant for thalassemia. And if you look at the overall survival, the overall survival in haploidentical stem cell transplant was reported to be 68%, which is significantly lower than the outcomes of MST transplants or the MUD transplants. So this figure is basically representing the initial years, and the main reasons attributable to this lower survival were the high rates of graft rejection associated with presence of HLA antibodies, or the poor selection of patient also matters a lot. Poor selection of patient, incomplete or poor preparation of your patient for the transplant resulted in increased first 100-day mortality, resulted in increased graft rejection, and resulted in increased rate of GVHD. So these are the factors which were observed during the first 10 years. So all the transplant groups, they started to focus on improving these factors so that better outcomes can be achieved. So it is very crucial for me to discuss the PESARA risk stratification, because almost all transplanters, when they are planning a transplant, they rely on this risk stratification. But I would like to point out that PESARA risk classification was basically developed in late 1980s and early 1990s to predict the outcome of stem cell transplant. But it was basically developed taking into account the patients who were being managed in developed countries like Italy, China, or Thailand, where at least healthcare resources and patient management was much better. But on the contrary, if you look at the kind of patients that we see in low middle income countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, almost 20 to 30% of our patients, they belong to a very high risk subset of this PESARO 3. See, the worst outcomes have been reported with PESARO 3, but we are seeing patients who belong to the very high risk group of PESARO 3. I hope I'm able to convey my message. This group is defined by age more than 7 years. It's very common for us to receive patients who are seeking for transplant, and they're 7 year, 8 year, 10 year, 14 years of age. And then the second most important factor which counts for the adverse prognosis is the liver size, which is more than 7 centimeter and which corresponds to liver fibrosis. So this is very common in our day-to-day practice. Almost 50% of thalassemics that we see, they belong to very high risk groups. So this PESARO risk classification, it basically does not concord with the type of patients that we are seeing. So this group of patients poses the biggest challenge when we are planning the patient for transplant, because they have got higher propensity of graft failure and GVHD at the same time, and because of end organ damage, the first 100-day mortality, which we call transplant-related death, is also very high in these cases. So haploidentical stem cell transplant, though it is a promising strategy and should be adapted, but it comes with significant risk of mortality and morbidity. Major caveats that we find in the success of haploidentical stem cell transplant for thalassemia are the high rates of graft rejection and the high rates of acute GVHD, which can go up to as high as 40% in some cases. So there are certain factors which are responsible for causing GVHD and graft failure. And if we being the transplanters, if we are able to recognize these risk factors, or if we are able to modify them or tailor them according to our individual needs, then we can achieve a better outcome. So we can broadly classify these risk factors into two categories. Some of the factors are patient related and some are transplant related. So the patient related factors, of course, they cannot be changed, because if the patient factors like age, PESARO risk, we cannot change these factors. We have to accept the patient in the same condition. Iron overload, of course, we can to some extent we can treat it and delay the transplant because of iron overload and try to improve the ferritin levels, but somehow we have to accept the patient in the same condition. But then we have some transplant related factors that can be modified, for example, by optimizing our conditioning regimes, by removing the anti-HL antibodies, by increasing the stem cell doses, by removing the donor T cells from the graft, and by selecting a better graft source, we are able to achieve good outcomes. So let's talk about GVHD first. As you all know that the main culprit for causing GVHD, acute GVHD and chronic GVHD, is the presence of donor T cells in the graft. So a number of graft manipulation techniques have been introduced over the years. I'm sure you all are familiar with the traditional approaches. This can be achieved by two means. You can either go for ex vivo T cell depletion or in vivo T cell depletion. So the most traditional way of removing the donor T cells is to either you go for a positive CD34 selection, you collect the stem cells first, process the stem cells through a machine or equipment that is actually a cell separator, and collect the CD34 positive cells and infuse to the recipient in mega doses. This is a traditional approach, but it had its own caveats, like there was always a risk of losing the mononuclear cells, and there was a risk of graft failure associated with that. So this technique is now almost, obsolete. It's not being performed in most of the centers. There are some new modifications in this technique, that is the negative selection of T cells, that I'm going to talk about later. So currently, the most widely used graft manipulation technique, which is basically used across the globe in all diseases, all hematological indications, is the in vivo T cell depletion. That is, you infuse the stem cells unmanipulated, and then you achieve this in vivo depletion by means of pharmacological agents, that is with post-transplant cyclophosphamide or anti-thymocyte globulin. So basically this post-transplant cyclophosphamide, its introduction as a GVHD prophylaxis, it actually, shift the paradigm completely, and the outcomes of transplant, hepatorenal stem cell transplant, drastically improved after its introduction. So I will talk a little bit about post-transplant cyclophosphamide. It actually, it has become a key element of GVHD prophylaxis, there is no doubt about it. And it actually works by inducing a state of immune tolerance in the patients, and when given at higher doses on, defined timings, after the donor stem cell infusion, it actually eliminates the rapidly proliferating alloreactive donor T cells from the graft, which are actually responsible for causing GVHD. So at the same time, because of its high dose and its timings, which are it is basically given after day 3 or day 4 of transplant. So this gives a protective effect to the stem cells and to the regulatory T cells, which are actually required for a successful engraftment. So this is the best, advantage of using post-transplant cyclophosphamide. Then you spare the stem cells, you spare the regulatory T cells, thereby, ensuring reliable engraftment in these patients. And at the same time, sparing of some T cells, residual T cells, provides anti-infective immunity, so the risk of infections is minimized. So I would like to mention here, especially because thalassemia is a very difficult disease to treat, the marrow is completely, in most of the cases in high-risk patients who have severe iron overload, the marrow is compromised. So the immunity is somehow very low. So with standard doses of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, it was observed that patients are having viral reactivations, hemorrhagic cystitis, these kind of complications were limiting the success of transplant. So a lot of innovations have been made in the use of PTCy. And I would like to mention here about the dose optimization. It is a newer approach. I was just discussing about it a few minutes ago with Brigadier, and I was telling him that, you can go for lower doses of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, like 25/2, rather than using a standard dose of 50/2. And you can even combine this post-transplant cyclophosphamide with other immunosuppressive agents like anti-thymocyte globulin or thiotepa to achieve maximum benefit out of it. And then there are some novel combinations that are still under different phases of clinical trials. For example, in which cyclophosphamide has been combined with ruxolitinib and has been combined with tacrolimus and mycophenolate mofetil. So there are some new innovations coming up. and we expect them to help us in better selection of GVHD prophylaxis. So I would like to share a paper which was published in 2023 in Blood Journal, and it was published by a Chinese group basically, and they tried to combine low dose PTCy with ATG as a prophylaxis for GVHD in alternate donor transplants. They basically transplanted 40 patients of beta thalassemia, and out of which 10 patients were haploidentical, received haploidentical donor grafts. And if you look at the outcome of haploidentical stem cell transplant, GVHD prophylaxis, as I told you, it was a combination of 2 drugs. Standard conditioning regime was given, and they reported 100% 5-year survival in this paper, as well as the rates of acute GVHD and chronic GVHD was only 10%. So I think this data is amazing. We can reliably say that lower doses of cyclophosphamide, if combined with other immunosuppressants, can provide us maximum effects, maximum benefit without compromising the engraftment. Moving towards the pharmacological pre-transplant immunosuppression, the introduction of this PTIS regime for thalassemia patients is considered as a revolutionary step in the management, not only for haploidentical stem cell transplant, but also for PESARO-3 group of patients who are undergoing MST transplants as well. So basically, this has brought a fundamental change in the outcomes of transplant. The main rationale for using this pre-transplant immunosuppression is to actually suppress the host immunity long before when the actual transplant conditioning is going to be started. So this can be achieved by a combination of pharmacological agents like fludarabine and dexa, along with some other drugs, and then some procedures can be involved to obtain desensitization effect. So basically, what happens, fludarabine and dexamethasone, which is the most commonly used agent for PTIS, it is given and it suppresses the T cell mediated graft rejection, and then it is followed by azathioprine or hydroxyurea, which are the cytoreductive agents and immunosuppressant combination. Basically, it provides some, it creates a space in the donor, in the recipient marrow, so that when donor cells are received, they get some space to be engrafted. And at the same time, this combination of immunosuppression, it also helps us in reduction in the production of anti-HL antibodies in the serum, which are actually the main culprit for causing graft rejection in haplo setting. And the best thing which we obtain, or the main objective of using this pre-transplant immunosuppression, is this enables us to use reduced intensity conditioning rather than going for myeloablative conditioning, because we have already suppressed the host immunity enough with this PTIS therapy. So patients do not require to undergo myeloablative conditioning. And with this, what happens, because we use RIC, so the transplant related mortality in turn decreases, the risk of infections decreases, and the risk of graft failures also decreases. This is the largest data so far published on using this novel combination of PTIS with post-transplant cyclophosphamide and reduced intensity conditioning. This paper was published in 2020 from Thailand. In this study, they transplanted 83 patients of transfusion-dependent thalassemia with haplografts, and using standard conditioning, reduced intensity conditioning, and PTIS protocol. I will show you the PTIS protocol that they followed. This comprises of 2 blocks of fludarabine and dexamethasone, which were given at 4 weeks apart, at a gap of 4 weeks in between, some desensitization effect against the HL antibodies. And this was then followed by reduced intensity conditioning and donor stem cell infusions. So this is a standard PTIS protocol, which most of the centers have adapted as it is, including my center in Pakistan. After the success of this, procedure and protocol, we in Pakistan are also using the same protocol. So the projected 3-year event-free survival and overall survival in this study was reported to be 96%, which was incredible. Another paper I have put in, it is from, this study was conducted by Dr. Revati and her colleagues in Apollo Chennai, India. And since I keep on saying that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the patients, their phenotypic characteristics are much similar. So it was very important for me to share data from India. Dr. Revati has reported the outcomes of 20 patients who received this augmented immunosuppression along with RIC and post-transplant cyclophosphamide. And after a median follow-up of 10 months, the thalassemia-free survival reported in her study was 75%, whereas the overall survival is 95%. So I think again, if we take into account this paper, this data, this gives us a very encouraging, a concept of using PTIS in our patients, and we can, be hopeful that our patients are going to do well also. This is regarding the most contemporary approach of graft manipulation, which has been currently employed in almost all the centers in the developed countries, where they negatively selects the alpha beta T cell subset from the donor graft, which is actually responsible for causing or mediating the acute GVHD. So this is a newer approach basically. This has brought the risk of the percentage of GVHD to as low as 0%. And the best thing about this type of technique, this graft manipulation technique, is that you don't even need to give or continue the immunosuppressions post-transplant for a long time. You can even stop after 3 months of transplantation. I will share here the latest publication. This was published in the beginning of the same year, 2025, from Germany. They have reported the outcomes of 20 patients who received haploidentical grafts, and they compare it, the total number of patients in this study was 20, out of which 13 received haploidentical graft, whereas 7 patients received matched sibling donor grafts. And in this study, they have reported like none of the patients who received haplo graft, which was T cell depleted, none of them experienced acute or chronic GVHD. And if you look at the transplant characteristics of the T cell depleted graft versus MSD, it is almost same. Even the immune reconstitution timings, if you look at the lower square, the immune reconstitution in the T cell depleted graft occurred at the same time as in the MSD transplant. So the results are very encouraging. But of course, this procedure or this modality of transplant has its own limitations. Like it is not very cost effective for the low middle income countries, centers working in low middle income countries. It requires a lot of expertise. It requires a special equipment. The kits are very expensive. So though it is a promising strategy, but still, we need resources for this to arrange it. Moving on towards the desensitization strategies. Basically, we all know that the main culprit for graft failure in thalassaemic children is the presence of HLA antibodies in the recipient serum, which are usually against class 1 and class 2, but there are some minor antigens also which cannot be picked up in the PRA panel. So this is the main reason in most of the cases. Almost 50% of graft failures that we see are mainly because of the presence of HLA antibodies. So a lot of study groups have designed some desensitization strategies to get rid of these HLA antibodies and to achieve stable engraftment in these patients. Most of the centers, they agreed upon using a combination of regimens like pharmacological agents plus plasmapheresis and other immunotherapy agents to achieve maximum effect and to get rid of the antibodies fully. So I would mention here about 3 things that we are usually following in most of the centers. The first thing to be given is rituximab, which is a monoclonal anti-CD20 antibody, and it targets the B cells specifically, and it stops the production of anti-HLA bodies from the anti-HLA antibodies from the recipient serum. So this has to be given long before the transplant is planned, or almost 60 days or 50 days away from the transplant. You have to give it to achieve maximum benefit. This is followed by 1 or 2 or 3 sessions of plasmapheresis, which actually removes the circulating DSAs in the recipient at the time when patient is just prepared for the conditioning. And then the third thing, which is very important, that is intravenous immunoglobulin, which actually removes the residual antibodies in the blood which are left behind after the plasmapheresis, and it should be given very, very near to the conditioning regime. So, to make sure that when the donor cells are infused, there are no antibodies at all. So, I've tried to summarize all the major studies published in the recent years in which this desensitization protocol has been used. Most of the study groups have utilized 2 or 3 combinations to make sure that maximum effect is produced. And if you look at the mean fluorescence index of the antibodies, this MF5, 5000, 2000, this represents the mean fluorescence index, meaning how much load of the antibodies is there. So even patients having a load of more than 5000 MF5, they have been transplanted, and almost all studies have showed that 100% engraftment occurred with the usage of this desensitization strategies, provided they combine it with PTIS and appropriate conditioning was offered to the patients. So the last thing to mention about haploidentical stem cell transplant is that despite all the measures that we take to prevent graft rejection and to prevent this GVHD, there is a substantial amount of patients, like let's say 10 to 20%, who suffer from poor graft function. Poor graft function is defined as when you have a full donor chimerism or a mixed donor chimerism, but the bone marrow is completely aplastic. Because of the conditioning, toxicity of the conditioning, or because of the CMV reactivation, infections, HL antibodies, the marrow becomes aplastic, but you still have donor chimerism. So the only way to rescue your patient in this situation is to give a stem cell boost, CD34 boost. It helps, but it has its own terms and conditions. You have to be sure, like there is no whenever you are planning a CD34 boost, you make sure that at least the patient, you need to gain some time. Basically, you have to spend at least 50 to 60 days of transplant, because in cases where donor chimerism is more than 50% and you are planning a boost, you should realize that the donor T cells are still active in the recipient, so they can lead to, and if you give a boost from behind, it is going to cause a deadly acute GVHD in the patient. So you have to wait for at least 60 to 90 days to make sure that the alloreactive donor T cells are, they're settled and they're not active anymore in the recipient. Then you give a boost. So that in this case, you will achieve a better outcome. But if you think because sometimes it happens, like, even if you have less than 50% chimerism or there's no donor chimerism at all and you are trying to give a boost, you will end up in giving GVHD and no improvement, no benefit of achieving the engraftment in these patients. So better to avoid in the absence of chimerism. It will help only if there is some chimerism at least. If there's a complete primary graft failure, then you should consider second transplant. CD34 boost will not help. So this is a message. Just a few slides regarding current practice in Pakistan. As far as Haplo is concerned, we are using this PTIS combination with desensitization protocols and RIC and post-transplant cyclophosphamide if the DSA is positive. But if the DSA is negative, then we just omit this desensitization protocol from our treatment plan. This was the first haploidentical transplant that we performed in Karachi in my institute in 2017. This boy was 4-year-old at that time, and on the right side you can see that mashallah he's now a grown-up boy living a healthy normal life. His mother was his donor actually, but alhamdulillah there was no GVHD seen at all. So this is the outcome of different centers in Pakistan who are currently offering stem cell transplant for thalassemia and other indications. At the moment in Pakistan, we have 13 functional transplant centers, and almost all of them are doing transplants for benign indications and malignant indications. There's no segregation at the moment. And if you look at the overall survival of patients in our centers, it ranges between 70 to 80%, which is, I think, comparable to any other neighboring country. So I would end my presentation by saying that this is all in all a package, like by optimizing transplant strategies, by controlling the risk of infections, by providing stringent supportive care, I think we can improve the outcome of haploidentical stem cell transplant in our region. And that is all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have. That's it.